Welcome to day 9 of the Novel Challenge. My name is Brad Pauquette, and today we are going to talk about the driving conflict. So we are 9 days into this challenge, which means that we are 10% of the way through. And if you're anything like me, at this point, you're probably thinking, oh my gosh, we are 10% of the way through, and I haven't even written any words yet. How am I possibly going to get this done? But let me take a moment right now to reassure you that you are doing the work of writing a novel right now. So this is the work that successful writers do in order to get to a completed manuscript. I've worked with literally hundreds of writers to help them to craft novel manuscripts. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that novel manuscripts don't go unfinished because the writer is not good at writing. They don't go unfinished due to a lack of creativity. They don't even go unfinished due to a lack of motivation or inspiration. Novel manuscripts go unfinished due to a lack of doing the work that we are doing right now. Because here's the other side of that coin. If you have a plan and then you put in the time, you will finish a novel manuscript. At that point, if you can follow that strategy, it's simple mathematics. If you put in the time on a plan that you've already established, then you can proceed with full confidence that you are going to finish this project. And not only are you going to finish it, but you're going to have a manuscript that works at the end of it. Now, of course, your manuscript won't be perfect. The writing is going to need to be revised. You're going to have to tweak it and do all the things that happen in the next steps of this process. But nonetheless, you will have a complete manuscript, and you will have confidence that the story itself, the structure is good, that audiences are going to be able to relate to it. And that's going to be a game changer as you move through this drafting process, and then as you move into revisions at the end of this 90 days. So today we're going to talk about the driving conflict. This comes from chapter 11 of the Novel Matrix book. So at this point, you should be planning out your novel manuscript. You should be using the worksheets that you grabbed at novelmatrix.com/worksheets. And so you're planning out your conflicts, you're planning out your plot structure and your characters and your universe. And if it's not done yet, don't worry. It's not supposed to be done yet. We are still in this stage where we are moving pieces around and getting things organized. And I think what we talk about today might be helpful as you move forward in that. So there's no pressure to have that complete yet. For the next several days, we're going to continue to work with that and tweak it. Our goal is that by the end of this week, you have a complete plan that you feel really good about, so that at the beginning of next week, you can start putting words on the page. You can start that drafting process. And of course, that'll be really exciting next step to get to. But first, we want to do this part really, really well. So remember that over the course of your narrative, your protagonist is going to do an impossible thing. And if the plot structure is well thought out, we should always be able to state your story in those terms. So my protagonist does something impossible. For instance, with Star Wars, we can say Luke Skywalker, who is a farm boy on the outskirts of the galaxy, blows up the biggest, baddest super weapon the universe has ever seen. So Luke Skywalker is in this position, but he, through this adventure, becomes a person that can do this impossible thing. And when you can state your story that way, and it makes sense that this thing is impossible and why it's impossible for that character, then there's a good chance that you have enough meat to the story there that you can justify drawing the reader through that 3-act structure. One of the things that's really important about that impossible thing is that it's impossible for the protagonist at the beginning of the story. So the impossible thing doesn't need to be impossible for anyone. It doesn't need to be impossible for your reader. It simply needs to be impossible for the protagonist. So, as a really simple example, if your protagonist is deathly afraid of knives at the beginning of the story, they don't have knives at home. They don't cook in the kitchen. They don't even own knives. If they get a steak, they just, chew it off the end of the fork or something like that. If that's who the protagonist is at the beginning of the story, then the impossible thing could very well be that the protagonist is going to cook stir fry in his own home at the end of the story. You know, he's going to chop up all the vegetables and fry it up. And that is an impossible thing because it was impossible for the protagonist. Now, we also see the opposite problem with some protagonists who are very heroic. Um, so, like something that might be impossible for me at the end of the story, if it doesn't seem like it should be impossible for your protagonist at the beginning of the story because they are, you know, just so cool, so strong, so smart, so whatever the thing is, then that is also going to fall flat for your audiences. This is often a problem with sequels, especially like superhero movies. You know, Iron Man 2, for instance. In the beginning of the story, there has to be a reason to strip away Tony Stark's power in order so that the audience can believe that something would be impossible for him, because the first movie has convinced us that he can overcome just about anything. So the second movie has to begin by taking his agency and his power away. So, as you're thinking about that impossible thing, keep that in mind. It has to be impossible for the protagonist who begins the story. And then over the 3 acts, that impossible thing is going to become possible and even plausible for the protagonist to complete. And so that brings us to the driving conflict. The driving conflict is the most prominent conflict in your novel manuscript. So you have 5 conflicts that you are working on developing right now. And while all 5 of them need to be present in the manuscript, one of them is going to get more airtime than any of the others. It's going to become more important to the reader. And it's the driving conflict that gives us that sense of satisfaction at the end when it's completed. Not all 5 of your conflicts will be wrapped up at the end of the book, but the driving conflict must be completed because that's what leaves us feeling satisfied and gives us that moment of catharsis where we have an emotional release at the end of the book. So the driving conflict is the conflict that most closely correlates to the impossible thing in your story. So for instance, in Star Wars, the impossible thing that Luke does is he blows up the Death Star. Now, that battle over the Death Star is really a manifestation of his external conflict with Darth Vader, right? His little world external conflict is Luke Skywalker versus Darth Vader. And the way that we see that play out in story is in this battle over the Death Star. Luke wants to destroy it, and Darth Vader very much wants it to stay in one piece. And so that impossible thing relates directly to that external conflict that Luke is dealing with. And as viewers of that story, as long as the driving conflict is resolved, we really have a lot of tolerance for the remaining conflicts to remain unresolved. And sometimes that can even be helpful. I'll touch on that again in just a moment. So similarly, in It's a Wonderful Life, which is one of my favorite movies, George Bailey, who is played by Jimmy Stewart, his driving conflict is his internal conflict. He wants to be successful, but he also wants to save his small town, and he feels this obligation to his small town. And in his mind, those two things are incompatible. And so through the course of the story, that's what drives the conflict. And so we still have 4 other conflicts, and we still have some subplots and things like that that are also getting attention through the story. But that internal conflict is really what carries the audience through the story. And at the end, he resolves that conflict by changing his mindset and finding a new paradigm that says no one is a failure who has friends. So he finds a compromise between those two positions that he couldn't understand before because of who he is and his identity and his family status and what he had decided was good and bad and right and wrong and things like that. And so because that driving conflict is resolved for George Bailey at the end, we could really let the rest of the conflicts go. In fact, the big world conflicts like Mr. Potter is still a problem. Actually, there's been no progress on the Mr. Potter situation in the town of Bedford Falls. And also, we see a resolution of the external conflict, which is George Bailey against the bank inspector. But really, I submit to you that George Bailey could go to jail at the end of the movie. That could be how that external conflict wraps up. Like, George, I'm glad you feel better, but you still got to go to jail. But as an audience, we would still feel satisfied with that ending because it's the driving conflict That's the conflict that we were invested in through the story has been resolved. So even though he would have to go to jail, we'd still feel really good about it. So you have a few tasks today. One is as you consider to as you continue to develop those 5 conflicts for your story, I want you to decide which one is the driving conflict. So that's step 1, identify the driving conflict. Step 2, make sure that the driving conflict closely correlates to the impossible thing. They need to be really strongly related because, again, the conflict that drives the story is the one that we want to have that cathartic release for at the end. So that when they accomplish the impossible thing, we can feel in our bones how that relates to that conflict that we've been watching through the story. That's step 2. And then thirdly, make sure that the driving conflict matches your major plot points. So we call it the driving conflict because it's the conflict that drives the story. So this conflict needs to be present throughout your narrative. So your rock bottom moment, your Icarus moment, your epiphany, all of these things need to be most closely related to that driving conflict that you've selected. Problem that we sometimes see in the planning stages, but then also in written manuscripts is that, the impossible thing doesn't relate to those other points. So, like the rock bottom moment is all about the character's internal conflict, and the Icarus moment is all about the philosophical conflict, and then the epiphany moment is all about one of the other conflicts, and then the impossible thing is about something else entirely. And so we've left the reader feeling scattered, like they were investing in this conflict and then they're investing in the next one and the next one and the next one, rather than giving one single driving conflict that pulls them through the entire story. So all of those key moments in the 3-act structure need to relate to the driving conflict. And when you do that, now the reader can invest appropriately in the most prominent conflict throughout the story. And when we get to that climax, now they feel satisfied. They feel a release of the conflict that has been pulling them through the entire story. So as long as we are developing that driving conflict and we're giving it the prominence that it deserves, and our plan generally matches, the emphasis on that driving conflict, there's actually a lot of value in leaving some of the other conflicts unresolved. As readers, our brain is programmed to ruminate on unfinished tasks. Right. This is why if you've ever had a song stuck in your head, experts on this type of thing say that one of the best ways to get that song out of your head is to listen to the entire song. Because there's a good chance that it's stuck in your head because your brain is treating it like an unfinished task. And so as soon as you finish the task, then that is going to go away. So when we think about those 5 conflicts that we have in our plan, when we resolve all of them, then we check all the boxes and your reader's brain can just go ahead and put that manuscript away. It's done. That book is complete. It's all over. There's nothing left to think about. However, as long as we resolve that driving conflict, we're still going to give the reader that sense of release and that sense of satisfaction from the book, but leaving some of those other conflicts unresolved is actually going to give them something that sticks in their brain. Right? It gives them something that when they're driving the car or doing the dishes or mowing their lawn or, as they're laying in bed trying to go to sleep at night, it gives their brain something to be thinking about, saying, I wonder what happened to the mother-in-law. I wonder how that worked out in the story. And so in most stories, we see that the driving conflict is always resolved without question, needs to be done. Usually, the protagonist may solve or at least make significant progress on 1 or 2 other conflicts. However, the other 2 to 3 conflicts should be left unresolved, and that's actually going to be helpful for your storytelling. So, as we continue to work out that plan, continue to put the time in, moving those pieces around, rearranging things until they fit just right on that plan. as I said yesterday, work in pencil. As you go, you're identifying a rock bottom moment. But as we talk about driving conflict, maybe you're saying, oh, I think maybe there's a better way to correlate a rock bottom moment so that it also fits better with the driving conflict, because that's where I want to be leading the reader. So you're continuing to move those pieces around and to formulate your plan. But today, you're also going to pay special attention to that driving a conflict. On your plan, go ahead and put a square around what you believe is the driving conflict. And then make sure that matches the impossible thing that the protagonist is going to achieve in the manuscript. And as it goes, make sure that your key plot elements also match that driving conflict, that all of the key moments in the story are following a similar beat so that your reader has that element of satisfaction and cathartic release at the end of the story. So continue planning. Continue to have fun with this. This is the low pressure stage. You still just get to play with ideas. So even if you feel like you've settled into your idea, still be playing with it. Ask the question, well, what if I did change it? What if I did change a rule of the universe? What would happen to the story then? And as you allow your mind to play, you continue to come to a better and better solution. And this is the work of writing a novel. This is the work that novelists do. And it's the work that ensures that all of the time that you put in over the next 90 days is going to pay off for you. So move forward, have fun, and be confident, that you are investing your time wisely through this period of the process. So tomorrow we'll reconvene for day 10, and we're going to talk about how to make a scene plan. So as your plan for those, the conflicts and the characters and the plot structure continues to come together, now how do we actually turn that into actionable scenes so that you can start putting words on the page? And that's going to be a lot of fun. So until I see you tomorrow, happy writing and be blessed.